Hey, YouTube, Marshall here. We're back with in-person recordings of the Realignment. I'm speaking with Josh Steinman. He served on Trump's National Security Council and was the director of cyber there. Really wide-ranging conversation, lots of interesting things. I'm sure you all will get a kick out of this. We'd love to hear any suggestions for Austin or Texas-based folks who are bringing on the show to keep up these great in-person recordings. Hope you enjoy the episode. Josh Steinman, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks, Marshall. Good to be here.
It's incredibly good to be here because we're in person. It's funny. I don't think we're going to get into a screaming match here, but listeners are always like, Marshall, why aren't you pushing back and arguing with people? And it's so hard to do that over Zoom when you can't actually see someone's face and you can't actually read, oh, is this person chill? Can they really take it? So I will call you out if we need to do it versus the Zoom version. Let's just start with something newsy that people can use. Obviously, folks have their attention on Ukraine and Taiwan right now. And in many ways, we could see these two conflicts or potential conflicts in the case of Taiwan as like a presaging of what the future could look like. It seems like out of all the forms of the debate about the wars, cyber is probably the aspect where we're probably seeing things happening right now. Is that a true summation?
Yeah, it is and it isn't. So it's very interesting to watch the Russians prosecute the conflict in Ukraine because it really is this return to combined arms warfare. I do think we are seeing a lot of cyber activity, but I don't think that it's definitive, which is pretty interesting. I think some of the activity that's going on was the Russians early trying to brush off the Europeans by explaining that they essentially had fewer constraints than expected. There was some activity around Eastern European transportation and logistics that I saw very, very early, actually pre-conflict, that I thought was Russian messaging, but I don't have any proof of that. But it just seemed that way. A bunch of ports went down due to cyber attacks. So I think that we're sort of seeing what those tools can do in the constraints of a modern conflict that actually requires bodies on the ground, mile to mile movement of mechanized forces.
And what about Taiwan? I remember seeing in the news that when Nancy Pelosi made her trip, after the trip, there were some cyber attacks on Taiwan. How was that playing out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think that the conflicts are going to have as many similarities as folks would think. So, a Taiwan conflict is very much about brushing off the United States and convincing us from the Chinese perspective not to get involved. And so I think that cyber is probably going to play a much bigger role in that type of a conflict. It's also going to be about demoralization and convincing the Taiwanese people to not fight back. And so there are quality of life things that you can do. There are military logistics things that you can do as the Chinese to convince those two populations to essentially shut up and let this happen. And I think that's slightly, I wouldn't say that it's different. It's just that what we're seeing now in the corollary would be the Chinese have landed on Formosa and they're fighting, to take the country. Right?
Formosa. I've not heard a Formosa reference in forever. I don't think I've ever heard. I've seen it in books. I haven't actually seen Formosa, someone visual, stating
right,
it before.
It was the island that they're on. Yeah. Anyway, the island, whatever. So that's the phase that we're at, whereas I think the cyber stuff is more likely to be effective in those early stages as messaging, as preparation, et cetera. So we'll see. But I think Ukraine was always going to have to be much more of a post-World War II industrial fight, whereas the Taiwan fight very much happens before the fighting happens, right, in that convincing of populations.
That's interesting. So with cyber especially, I think it's helpful to sort of separate the Hollywood version versus the real version. And the reason why I was bringing up Ukraine is I think a lot of folks, including myself, obviously, had this image before the war of Russia is going to launch this cyber attack.
Yeah.
Capital C, capital A.
Yeah.
Ukrainian infrastructure goes down.
Yeah.
Their missile systems don't work. What is, in this type of industrial combined arms conflict that you're referring to?
Mm-hmm.
Probably helpful to define combined arms too, of course, for folks. But what can cyber actually do, quote unquote, versus that Hollywood version that I just gave?
Yeah. So the Russians have been attacking Ukrainian critical infrastructure for years. Very well-known attack and well-documented attack occurred, I think at this point, over 5 years ago, where Russian military cyber forces attempted to take down the Ukrainian power grid. You can look up Black Energy, or your viewers can look up Black Energy and read all about it. That was not very successful, but it demonstrated clear capabilities that the Russians were developing, including tooling that they could use in other places. And it is purported that they have used that tooling in other places in order to gain access to power grids and try and deploy tools that would enable them to do things like take them down. In the Ukraine scenario, what saved that country's power grid was that in many cases, there was still a lot of manual operation required, right? So the grids weren't at the level of like super digitized infrastructure like we have in some places here in the United States. So again, while I don't have the type of information that I've previously had when looking at these types of things, my guess would be that the Russians were quite active, but they're running up against the operational realities of what is actually effectable using these types of tools in Ukraine's critical infrastructure.
You know, it's interesting. We'll obviously get into this with your company, Galvanick, but I want to talk about that manual versus digitized summation, because in your National Conservatism Conference speech, you really talked about for the past 30 years, we've had this very specific project of digitizing previously manual processes. In the case of the power grid, what is the advantage of a digitized system relative to the vulnerabilities you're exposed to? Because the lesson from Ukraine can't be, and that's why we need to go back to the mid-'70s when this was all manual. How should we think about the trade-offs there?
It's interesting. I am a big fan of the science fiction writing of Neil Stephenson. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people complain about his writing. They say, oh, he doesn't know how to end books. I read his books, for the plot. It's fun. Many of them are fun. But also, in my mind, I think that most of his books try to wrestle with like very big, complex issues. And one of my favorite books that he's written is called Seven Eves. And I won't give away anything in the plot, but one of the big sort of philosophical questions that he deals with, he reveals like near the end of the book in this like throwaway 2-page section where the book takes place both in sort of present day and like thousands of years in the future, humanity, grand arc of humanity type of thing. And in the arc in the future, he's talking about a group of academics that created a new academic discipline that studied why certain human cultures developed certain types of technologies. Humanity kind of fragments in that book. And there are sort of clans, cadres, each that have like different type of evolutionary advantages. And he labels this academic study mystics after the Amish, who very clearly have a practice of looking at new technologies. They actually have mechanisms by which like they'll give responsible members of a community of their community, like, try this cell phone out for like X period of time, come back and report to us, like, do you think this will further our cultural practices or will it harm them?
Interesting.
And then they make a decision, which is why in many cases, like, They use steam power in a bunch of their factories. I've seen Amish people use flip phones, but not smartphones. I have seen photos of certain Amish groups using computers, but like only at work and only like Lotus Notes or something like that.
Yeah.
And the point is like that's a culture that's making technological decisions based on cultural values. And so what I like to tell people is there is an American amistics, but it doesn't have many of the constraints. It reveals things about our culture. And so, in my opinion, we aren't asking these questions, and it's an actual problem.
Yeah.
And so, in my opinion, there are decisions that we shouldn't be making that we absolutely are implicitly making, simply because we have this sort of McKinsey-driven 5 nines of uptime optimization culture that I think has been useful in driving a bunch of economic growth in the short term. But what I like to tell people about digitization of infrastructure and industry is that we are absolutely trading predictable downtime for unpredictable downtime. Like we have this Nassim Taleb style scenario where like we're essentially laying the groundwork for these black swan type of events to have catastrophic effects on our society. And we're doing it because quarterly earnings, optimization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have all these like structural drivers in society that are encouraging us to seek out these types of, really quick like economic dopamine hits. Like, hey, you gain X by having these types of technologies around as opposed to, doing the hard work of Y.
Yeah. And I totally get the framework. I'm curious then, what is an example of that? So what's something, to use the frame you gave us, where it obviously offers some benefit, but at a key level, in America doesn't have culture in the same way that the Amish would have, but undermines security, safety, resilience would probably be the best way to put it.
Well, I think America does have a culture. I
Okay.
just think it's much more complex than the Amish societies, which I think we would describe as having like a monoculture, where it's like they are all of the same culture. The American culture is like a culture of cultures, right?
Yeah.
If you want to go back to the sort of biological roots of that phrase, it is a thing in which we are all existing, and there are competing, bacterial efforts within that larger culture. So, I mean, at various orders of magnitude, you could say like globalization is one example of that. The trading away of the industrial base to Latin America and the Pacific Rim is one very clear example of like the decisions that we made were around financialization and financial optimization, and those had strategic, I'd say even moral, long-term impacts on the population of the United States, like massive job loss, incredible financial bifurcation of, what had been the middle class, et cetera.
And you're from Detroit, so obviously you're going to have...
I lived it, yeah.
Yeah, you lived it.
Yeah.
I think the next question then would be, I'm talking with you about these topics for a reason. The company that you're building now obviously hits all these topics, but I think the intermediate experience between serving in the Navy, getting into the startup space, was your time on the National Security Council. Can you talk about what your role was, and even just explain what the NSC actually is?
Yeah, it's this thing that everyone thinks they understand, but if you ask people questions, they don't. So I love taking the opportunity to explain what the NSC actually does. So we have government, right? We have 3 branches. We have an executive branch. We have a legislative branch. We have a judicial branch. What most people think of government is the stuff that exists within the executive branch. Those are things that we call departments or agencies. The Department of Defense exists within the executive branch. The CIA exists within the executive branch, the DOJ within the executive branch. The Constitution's quite clear. What's actually going on is the Constitution vests executive authority, the authority to do stuff on behalf of the American people, in the president. Mm-hmm. And then Congress goes about creating entities that answer to the president that can accomplish certain things. In the Constitution, it's like having a Navy. So it's like you have a Navy, and the Navy answers to the president. So whenever people think about the government, you just think that, okay, what you're really thinking about is like one of the three branches of government. Again, if you're not thinking about Congress or you're not thinking about the courts, the legislative branch. And so within the executive branch, again, people just think very abstractly about these things. But so the president sits at the White House, right? And then you have departments and agencies that are mostly in Washington, D.C. themselves. So the Department of Defense, most of those senior leaders sit at the Pentagon. Again, I mentioned CIA, and most of those folks sit at a place called Langley, which is publicly known. I'm not disclosing anything weird, et cetera. These places all have headquarters. But what's going on is the heads of those departments and agencies are essentially like senior staffers for the president. The president will go to the Secretary of Defense and say something like, implicitly, I need you to be prepared for the United States to do certain things if the Chinese decide to invade Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Now, what does that actually translate into? It translates into something that we call like contingency plans, con plans, where like the DoD will draw up a plan for like, hey, this is what we might do in these types of scenarios. What will they also do? Man, train, and equip combat-ready naval forces able to win wars, deter aggression, and maintain freedom of the seas. So by giving those types of implicit orders, like the president implicitly shapes the way in which the Department of Defense manifests itself in terms of like recruiting people to join the military, buying stuff that enables them to accomplish their mission, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So the DoD has missions, the CIA has missions, the Department of Energy has missions, the Department of the Interior, but all these things stem constitutionally, literally from an executive. Executive authority shall be vested in a president. That's pretty much what the Constitution says in the article that establishes the executive branch. So when the president makes foreign policy decisions, sometimes they have one department or agency that is responsive. Mm-hmm. So the president can go to the DoD and like, hey, I need you to build a Navy for me. And they'll say, okay, got it. We'll do it.
That's there. Yeah.
That's theirs. But when you give orders of any magnitude of complexity that require more than one department or agency, it's very important to make sure that all of the various people that have a part to play in that are all doing the same thing and moving towards the same outcome. That's what the National Security Council does. It's a coordination body. So you have staffers that sit in the White House, and what they do is they hold regular meetings with mid-level and senior level, and sometimes the very most senior level folks at those departments and agencies, and the meeting topic will be like contingency planning for potential invasion of Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm not saying that that specific meeting exists, but we're talking about Taiwan. We talked about Ukraine. So imagine that you would do something like that. Who would come to those meetings?
State, DOD, CIA, like that's where it's okay.
Exactly. So your deputy assistant secretaries at state and defense, your like senior SESs from the intelligence community. SES is a term that designates someone who is essentially like a flag officer, but a civilian, like an admiral or a general equivalent, but like in the CIA. Mm-hmm. SES can exist in any government agency, but they exist in the intelligence community. They're your senior folks. So those folks will all come to this meeting from like the various China elements, if we're having a type of meeting like that, and they'll come together and go over the plan or something like that. You'll do something where it's like, hey, we need to know what the plan is, and let's go through what all of you have done in facilitation of. So in many cases, the things that drive NSC activity are either like emergent situations. The North Koreans launched a missile. What are we going to do about it? Everybody comes to that meeting, which is run by probably a regional. There are regional and functional shops on the NSC staff. NSC staff, it's traditionally between 25 and 400 people. It just depends on the president. Those 25 to 400 people are, in many cases, civil servants. So they're members of the national security bureaucracy.
So they're not political appointees.
In many cases, but in some cases, the NSC staff are political appointees. So I was one of them. There were only like 25 to 30 of them during the Trump administration. And so I was one of a small group of political appointees that were NSC staffers at the very senior level. So I was what's called a senior director. I carried the rank of deputy assistant to the president. That's one step below the highest rank at the White House, which is assistant to the president. Essentially, in the order of precedence, I had, the rank of someone equivalent to an undersecretary. So I would convene meetings of deputy assistant secretaries, undersecretaries. Occasionally, a deputy secretary would come to one of my meetings, and it would be like, okay, we've got this issue in cyberspace, and I ran a shop called Cyber, which covered cyber, telecom, supply chain, and cryptocurrency policy. So anything that fell into those things, if it had an interagency flavor and the president cared about it, I was the one chairing the meeting and getting things ready. And what does it matter? Because the whole point is that eventually, if there's a conflict over what are we going to do, that question must be resolved by the president, ultimately, if you can't resolve it at the more junior levels. And so these meetings that you run on the NSC staff are all designed to hash out all the fights that people are having. Well, I say, we should, issue a statement and say the North Koreans are a threat to society. Maybe someone's saying that at DOD, or maybe state is saying that. And the DOD folks say, you shouldn't say that. We do missile tests all the time. And that would expose us to being accused of the same thing, et cetera. So you're maybe like hashing out a statement. That's usually in response to something. Or at the very strategic level, you're writing a strategy document that all those departments and agencies can get behind, and they're going to be like, okay, we're going to execute this. And those strategy documents, I wrote many of them. Actually, my team wrote many of them, and I helped or architected them, are things like a national strategy on 5G, which is a document that me and my team prepared. And so the NSC serves as that sort of nexus point for the executive branch that can coordinate proactively or respond reactively to things that are happening in the national security sphere. NSC staffers are the president's representatives to those departments and agencies in a way in which ostensibly affords the president the ability to make sure that his desires are happening through the executive branch that ultimately is his responsibility and authority.
What's interesting to me is, and folks may or may not know this NSC, like the NSC itself is like a post-World War II development. This is, developed during the Truman administration when you're reconstituting the American government, because America's obviously taken a bigger role in the world post-World War II, but also like the DOD itself is like changing all these different factors as a government. We all know the obvious things there. I'm curious, now that, you specifically refer to us as being in like a second new Cold War, do you think there are any ways the broader U.S. government structure should be revisited given the specific threat environment we're in right now?
Yes. There are people that would pay very much close attention to what I would say next. And so I won't say it. I think that there are a lot of things that we do as an executive branch, that the executive branch does, that could be done better. To change those things would require an incredible amount of effort, which I think would be worth it. And I'll just leave it at that.
No, that's completely fair.
What I tell people is
yeah.
we're fighting a digital war with an industrial, organization.
That's interesting. To what degree, without getting into specifics, is the task you're describing a partisan ideological one? So, for example, if I were to get the Biden administration version of you, of which there literally is, would the two of you directionally debate?
It'd be 4 of them. They replaced me with 4 people.
Okay, so this is your point about how this is anywhere from 25 to 400 people.
Yeah.
Would there be an ideological debate? Not about specific implementations, right? Would there be an agreement about, hey, what? Because you know how DC works. There's all sorts of broad spaces where there is, like, everyone agrees the defense procurement process is broken.
Yeah.
Now, what you do with that statement is controversial, but how does that work in your space?
There are a lot of challenges that people look at in cyber world that many believe can be resolved by these types of structural changes. I can go through a few of them.
Yeah, please.
So on Capitol Hill, there are like 8 different committees and God knows how many subcommittees that all deal with digital stuff, cyber stuff, Homeland Security committees, national security committees, intelligence committees, energy committees, on both sides of the House and the Senate. They all have lots of cyber responsibilities. So when people want to make big changes in law, again, now we're in that other branch of government, the first articulated branch of government in the Constitution, the legislative, it's very hard to do that because it would be as if, well, I refer to the digital world as reflective of the fact that we have invented this new soft technology, a soft technology being like power, right? Energy or money or the spoken word or the written word. It's something that can suffuse all of reality and enable the transfer of information, which is a large class of technology, with very low friction. And so I don't think that we've come to and I'm not saying that you need like massive legislative overhaul of the legislative branch itself, but I think you do need some type of leadership to establish like primacy over like who's going to make, who's going to hear out like certain types of potential proposed legislation on the Hill. So that's like one place. Like there, you got to do something.
Yeah.
I'm not a Hill guy. Like go talk to the next majority leader of House and Senate or whatever, and maybe they'll have some ideas. On the executive side, I think that most of the authorities exist for us to do anything of reasonable import. The point that I always tried to make, and I think tried to embody when I was the senior cyber policymaker in the United States government, was you have to put one person in charge and hold that person accountable. Mm-hmm. And that's,
what is accountable? What does that look like in a policy world? Right? Because you're leading a company now.
Yep.
Government is obviously different. What does accountability mean?
So my first week on the job, which was the first week of the Trump administration, I came up with a list of 6 strategic priorities that I wanted to drive. Each one had like sub elements that were like, achieve this by accomplishing that. Mm-hmm. There'd be like 5 or 10 things within those 6 priorities. But in all 4 years, I got every single one of them done. And
can you talk about any of them?
Sure. So telecom security.
The sexiest.
Yeah.
This is what your memoir is going to be focused on.
Yeah. So global telecommunications infrastructure. So it was like ensure the global. I think the way that I phrased, I had a card with these things written out in plain language that I kept on my computer monitor, and then I wrote them up on my whiteboard so anyone that came in could see them. Mm-hmm. So I think the language that I used was like, ensure the freedom and security of the global telecommunications infrastructure. That was my strategic goal. Now, what did it mean to do that? There was a ton of stuff that we had to do on the U.S. telecommunications infrastructure, specifically in driving out technologies and equipment manufactured by companies that have legal obligations to the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. Those are companies like Huawei, ZTE, et cetera. But other companies too. There was some action taken on Qihoo 360 just yesterday, Chinese technology company that we were also very interested in. So as you think about these types of things, like you need to be able to go to people within your apparatus and say, like, you are responsible for this topic, mm-hmm. and then I need to know what you're going to do about it, and then be able to again create metrics of success.
Yeah.
And so, I had those 6 priorities and I assigned them to my people. I assigned those subordinate tasks to my people. I have this thread that I've done. I don't know if I've done like a Substack on it or not. I have a Substack just like everybody else.
Yep. Link to show notes.
Yeah. Link to show notes, etc. Check out my SoundCloud. But
lots of 2002 rap.
Absolutely. Yeah. Me and Blake. Right. So I called it management by index card. Mm-hmm. So every person that came to work for me, part of my interview process was like, I showed them my index card and I was like, this is what I'm working on. Like, what are you going to be working on? Like, what are the 3 things that you're going to accomplish in the 2 years here that you're sitting in my office on behalf of the president? And I would literally ask them, like, what do I get if I hire you?
Is 2 years like a typical tour?
Yeah. So a typical tour is like 1, and then it's really 2 because it's extendable to 2. So like someone that leaves after a year, it's
something went wrong. That's a bad resume.
Yeah, that's like the startup version of getting fired at month 10.
Yeah,
they did invest. In some cases, people do have extraordinary opportunities sitting at the NSC, so they'll get like promoted early. In which case, especially for the military folks who are like 06 rank, which is 1 rank before flag officer, general or admiral.
So those are like the colonels, basically.
Yeah, exactly. They're colonels or in the Navy, they're captains, and they'll show up in a year and maybe they'll get like selected for admiral, in which case they will have to leave.
Yeah.
So not that everyone that leaves after a year is somehow marked, but generally most people serve 2 years on the NSC staff, or maybe 18 months maybe. It's a burnout job. So the point is like management by index card. Like, what am I going to get? And I literally hired, this is a cool story. So as a subunit of one of those things that I wanted to do, which in the broadest sense was impose what's the phrase? Impose costs on people that were doing bad things on the internet. Mm-hmm. It was like one big class of activity that I was working on. I hired a great guy who now has left federal service and is working in the banking sector. I won't mention his name, but guy's a legend. And he came to me, very young guy. He came to me, highly recommended. And I was like, what do you care about? Like, what should we be fixing in cyber, the big space? And he told me about the fact that at the time, you could rent infrastructure, meaning like server space, rack space, in the United States for pennies a day without any type of like, who is this person? Mm-hmm. So you'd go rent like a hard drive in a data center in Dubuque.
Where's Dubuque?
Iowa.
Okay.
Right? Like, somewhere in the middle of the country.
I didn't actually know that town, like what the pronunciation was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was like, Dubuque. Feels Midwest. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay.
I think it's Iowa, yeah.
Yeah.
And Detroit, whatever.
Yeah.
Cleveland, somewhere. Go rent a rack, like a blade, a server or something, like in a data center for 1 or 2 or 3 days. If you're like literally a Russian cyber actor, $2.50, $3, $5,
nothing.
Nothing.
Commodity product.
and use that to conduct like final attacks on people inside the United States. So, you'd say like, all right, that kind of sucks. Sure. What sucks even more though is that by doing that, you come under the protection of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments.
Explain that. Noting you're not a lawyer, but
you can't digitally like interrogate those people. Meaning like, if it's like Chinese strategic support force, military hackers, and they've like rented server space, in whatever state, Nebraska, Texas, you can't go in and shut them down because they're now a U.S. person and they enjoy the benefits of, the Constitution.
Yeah.
Because they're now, there's some commercial entities operating in the United States. And so one of the last things that we did was we worked on, and we'd been working on this for 2 years, KYC provisions for people that operate data centers.
So know your customer.
That's right. Very basic stuff, but it's like foreign cyber and intelligence services were renting these things with abandon, and we couldn't actually defend against that. They were doing IP theft. They still are. They were doing critical infrastructure, recon, all these things that get reported in the DNI's annual threat assessment. None of the stuff that I'm talking about is classified. It's all been talked about in the open. Mm-hmm. They were doing it from U.S. data centers, and law enforcement organizations like the FBI couldn't actually go and be like, who is this? We need to see this, or we need to block this, or what have you. And so, we worked for 2 years to impose those types of new requirements on folks. Really simple. It's just like, who is this person? Like, what credit card number did they use? Where are they dialing in from? Et cetera. What's the nominal identity of the person that you're renting this to? And so that would be like one example of like someone came to me with an idea and I was like, we have to do this.
Yeah.
It may seem like minor, but I can tell you it was very important. And there were a whole class of activities like that we engaged in over 4 years to try and impose costs on people that were and continue to be like doing very bad things to, American individuals and companies. And so in my book, the way that you hold people accountable is you have a single point. Like you can't have two people responsible for one thing. It doesn't make sense. And so to get back to your question of like, how should we structure things in cyber under President Trump? And, when I was in that office, there was one person responsible for coordinating all of this activity. No question. If I ever screwed up, my head was on the line. Mm-hmm. In previous iterations and in the current iteration, there's like multiple people that are responsible. You have this national cyber director. You have they elevated my title to be a deputy national security advisor. Again, we had one. They have like 6 or something. They have like 6 deputy national security advisors or God knows what. And then you have like 2 senior directors that answer to that one deputy national security advisor. These people are all American patriots. I think they're well-intentioned. But to have like 4 senior people that are all jockeying to own certain problem sets or affect certain types of outcomes, I've just found it to be the road to bureaucratic ruin. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it's about organizational structure, keep things very lean, very simple, and clearly articulate who's responsible for solving what problems. And when they fail to do that, get them to move on.
Last 2 things before we get to the present and what you're building now. I've noticed, well, this is obvious to anyone watching this on YouTube, and I know this personally because I'm chatting with you. You're like 20 years younger than I think I would expect to have this conversation with. And you're also pointing out the guy who, brought to your attention the KYC issue with the server rental young.
Yeah.
In both your cases.
Yep.
I think it's very easy to overstate the importance of being young. I think there's this, funny we had Eric Weinstein on the podcast once, and he was talking about, like it's a huge problem that Joe Biden is so old, and he articulated all these problems of America. And I'm like, wait, like Kamala Harris is like worse on every single one of those issues, like literally worse on every single one of those issues. We can't just treat being younger as an inherent better.
Yeah.
But that being said, like this is obviously like a younger podcast for folks who are listening. Like, what's your advice for talented people who think heterodox thoughts? I don't mean that in like the culture war sense, but like sometimes you can bring in new people, younger folks that have different, especially in cyber.
Yeah.
I'd say yours is especially a space. I'm not quite sure with like nuclear proliferation at the Department of Energy, this would kind of sink the same way.
Yep.
What's your advice to young people who would like to be in your position in the fellow you interviewed?
Yeah. You can't really plan it. I wish I could. My military career was like this as well. I had an insane military career. I got to do like ridiculous things that only existed for a brief period of time because we were fighting the GWAT.
So the global war on terror.
Yeah. I got recruited into a small corner of the military, did very exciting things for a few years, and then it was all gone.
So 1990s you doesn't have these experiences, obviously.
Yeah.
In the sense that like you joined the Navy in 1994, you're not joining the Bush administration. I would have
been a surface warfare officer. I would have been on a ship in the middle of the Pacific for however many years on and off.
Yeah.
And done staff duty.
And gone to business school afterwards. Like I could see your very specific life you would have lived.
Yeah. Instead, like, I got a tap on the shoulder as I was going through a training pipeline and got pulled into this other weird world because of an academic background that I had. So,
what's your academic background?
I'd been studying Al-Qaeda since before 9/11. Very, very in depth. On September 10th, 2001, I still have all my research notes. I'd spent that entire summer studying Al-Qaeda.
Interesting.
And I'm pretty convinced I'd read probably 95 to 99% of anything that had ever been written about Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden in English as of September 10th, 2001. So like the second plane hit, and I'd written this huge research paper on it. I was young and stupid.
So this is when you were an undergrad?
No, I was still in high school.
Okay, wow,
I spent
okay.
the summer
okay,
at Georgetown.
Yeah. Okay.
The summer before 9/11, I was at Georgetown taking a class in foreign policy, and I wrote my like final paper on escalatory dynamics between Al-Qaeda and the United States.
Okay.
And the paper was pretty simple. I was just like, there's no way to de-escalate this conflict. Like as we escalate, bin Laden's escalating.
Mm-hmm. So like
you have to do something different.
Nairobi bombing happens and you launch some cruise missiles at, a factory in Sudan.
Working.
Like that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, exactly. Need a new strategy. And so, like literally the second plane hit the World Trade Center and I was in class in high school and I was like, oh, this is an Al-Qaeda attack. And I literally went out, printed I had the paper with me at my laptop. I printed off like 10 copies of the paper, handed it out around my high school. But like that moment, it was very clear to me what had happened because Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had previously, Al-Qaeda has this thing where they like never, if Al-Qaeda still exists, the Al-Qaeda of the early to mid 2000s had this thing where they never they never gave up. So, the USS Cole was, the result of a bunch of attempts to bomb U.S. Navy vessels in and around the port of Aden in Yemen. And Al-Qaeda had been involved in previous attempts to blow up the World Trade Center. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had previously, not obsessed, but had done a lot of in-depth thinking about how to use airliners as weapons. There was a operation he tried to plan called Bajoinga, where they were going to do, I think, hijackings of like 11 different aircraft around the world and crash them into like places in Los Angeles, like places here, places there. And so airplanes, World Trade Center is very, very evident.
There had already been a bombing of the World Trade Center.
That was sponsored by people in the Al-Qaeda environment or Al-Qaeda itself, depending on how you... So anyway, and then I went off to college and did a whole bunch of work around that topic. And so I had come to the attention of various people in the extended apparatus. I applied to be surface warfare officer in the Navy, and then they pulled me out of that pipeline and got to do interesting things.
Okay, so then an actually useful takeaway then would be, Okay, so do you basically, in terms of what human agency does a listener have, the most applicable thing here was you were focused on the next thing.
Yeah.
During
I was focused on something that people weren't paying attention to that I thought was very interesting.
Yeah.
And so for like, I'll tell you some interesting, for examples. Have you seen these videos of this like Rainbolt guy on, he's got like a TikTok channel. He puts stuff on YouTube and then on Twitter, show notes.
Yeah.
He's a geoguesser.
Oh, yes, of course. He's
Amazing.
the guy, he'll see like a light pole
Yes.
in a dirt road. He'll be like, Uzbekistan.
Yes.
Because, yeah.
Like, if that's the stuff that you love, keep doing it.
Yeah.
That's my recommendation.
Yeah.
Like, you know, until on September 10th, like I was obsessed about something that was completely immaterial to, you know, the security of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, one episode, one event changed that. But if I tried to plan that day before, like, oh, how am I going to get involved in national security and this, that, or the other, you can't do it. I got to the NSC because an old boss of mine asked me to come help him staff the presidential transition. I couldn't have planned for this.
Yeah.
Like I've had friends that have done it. And so I kind of had a vague understanding of what that whole thing meant. But I go back to the concepts that John Boyd, who was an Air Force officer, often
OODA
told.
loops.
Yeah. So Boyd had this speech that he would give to people called "To Do or to Be."
Mm-hmm.
He's like, shooter. Like one day you're gonna have to make a call. Do you want to be the type of person that does something, or do you want to be the type of person who wants to be someone? You can't do both. That's what he's purported to have told a bunch of his acolytes in various times and places. So the point is, like, you can't plan to be. I don't think you can plan to be. I think it's a terrible way of living. Mm-hmm. But you can go out and find interesting things that you want to do, right? And so for your listeners, for the folks at home, et cetera, like my recommendation is find interesting things.
Yeah.
Go do them. Learn how to do them, et cetera. And at the same time, like for folks that are really interested in like national security or other things, like there are things that you can do to sort of bring yourself to the attention of folks, but they're not like the main thing that you're doing.
Yeah.
It's like write articles, keep a blog.
Substack,
like,
to your point.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's run a podcast.
Yeah.
Right? But it's not like I don't think it should be, or rather, if it were me doing it, I would not make it my main thing.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, that's why I encourage so many people that I've worked with from the military and even from the White House to like go into the startup space, go into the corporate world, like go have a real job. Like it teaches you how to like set goals, accomplish them, hold yourself responsible, hold people responsible, learn all these skill sets. There's a great book by Scott Adams called How to Fail at Everything and Still Win Big.
Yeah.
I think it's got like a big title as well. But in there, he talks about like building a skill stack. Mm-hmm. And he's like, I'm a guy that understands corporate America. I like to cartoon. I think I have a pretty good sense of humor. I understand how to write jokes. I enjoy drawing. Like he has this like weird skill stack. And he's like, it just so happens that enables me to be a cartoonist.
Yeah.
But as I built that skill stack, it wasn't like the thing. Like I wasn't like, how do I do X? And so I'm a big believer in that sort of methodology. People often like to point out that like I started a sock company.
Yeah.
The press loved to talk about this when I was at the White House. What they don't mention is that I did it while I was literally on active duty.
Yeah, I noticed the timeline there.
Yeah, I was an active duty military officer, and I was going to grad school at Georgetown at the same time. And I started this like somewhat successful apparel company because I had this itch, and I was like, I need to understand business. I was thinking about getting an MBA, but I was still on active duty. I knew that if I wanted to get an MBA, I'd have to leave. So I was like, that's going to be like 3 years from now.
Did you do security studies? Was that your...
Yeah. So like I knew I needed to get some kind of a master's degree for some certain optionality that I wanted professionally. Mm-hmm. If I was going to stay in or get out. But I was like, no, I really want to understand this business stuff. And so I started a company in what spare time I had when I was in the military, and that's this SOC company. So the press used to say he was previously a SOC entrepreneur, now running cyber. They don't mention all the other stuff.
Yeah.
It was then that I realized the press might actually be the enemy of the people. So like you have to explore these passions that you have. You have to like not indulge them, but like think about how to find ways to make them productive things. Like, think about your own journey here. Like you've got a very successful YouTube show / podcast. Like where did that come from? Like you were like, you know what? I'm going to try it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go do it. And like that's what I encourage everyone to do. And it may be that, it may be something else. But that's what I encourage these people to do, people that want to serve in these places. And then the way that you like make yourself known is, you at the same time go get yourself some fellowship at some DC think tank. But like don't be like a DC person.
Yeah.
Don't have that be like your main job. Like go work at like Oracle. Go work at I don't know. Go work at a startup.
It's really funny. Everything you're saying is just resonating with my personal experience because I came to DC in 2015, like right after college, and like everything was like, how do I become like a fellow at a think tank, like blah, 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 blah. And I didn't actually get any of those things until I just started doing. It was the podcast that got me a fellowship and got me in this position here. So that's just like hyper useful. Also, the funny thing to your point here is that when you were in high school, you just started writing and doing things. Once again, that's the key thing. It's even easier now. Like you actually could have just, you didn't have to print out those papers. Like you could have just had a Substack.
Yeah.
It was much more discoverable, all those things. So then last section here, I'd really want to wrap with Galvanick, right? Like what you're obviously working on now, and then relate the work that you're doing at your company to like your speech at the National Conservatism Conference, because that's where the implementation really comes in.
So for 4 years, I was the guy that would get the phone call in the middle of the night, like, hey, do we need to wake up the president? Weird stuff is happening in cyberspace. We think there might be an attack on this like water treatment facility. Like the computers aren't working. We couldn't restart them, blah, 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 whatever.
Yeah.
I had to live, you like live with a lot of, not guilt. That's like the wrong word, but it's like when you're in those jobs, in many cases, like you are the senior person that like so much rolls up to, and then you have to filter for your boss, the national security advisor, and his boss, the president. Mm-hmm. So you have to like you have to live with a lot. Like you have to take a lot of risk. Do we wake up the president? It's very easy to say yes, right? But you do that 4 times when it all turns to 0, and like you're done.
Yeah.
And so I feel so much better now that I'm not in that job, but which was a huge honor, but comes with a lot of stress. So I had to internalize that for literally 4 years. The average tenure in that job is like 18 months to 2 years. First man in, last man out on the Trump National Security Council, so staff. So for me, as I left that job, I started thinking about like, hey, what can I do to solve problems at the intersection of cyber and the industrial world? Originally, we were thinking about doing an insurance company, like a specific insurance company for cybersecurity for industrial infrastructure. So like insuring a factory against cyber attack. Did a ton of work there, months of work. Thought about spinning up what's called an MGA, Managing General Agent, which is a type of insurance company. Mm-hmm. I won't go into it. Just you can look it up if you're that curious. So we or your listeners can. We thought about doing that. We did a whole bunch of research, a whole bunch of work, and then couldn't get to conviction around like whether or not that was a good idea. Turned out to be true that our lack of conviction was driven by the economics, and the cyber insurance market has had a really rough year. because claims are going up, which means that the amount of money that people are getting charged for those policies has risen probably 5x in 2 years.
Okay.
It's pretty crazy. But like back at the time, I think we were sort of at the beginning of the hockey stick, and we started just really digging into the numbers, and we were like, this doesn't make any sense. Like we probably can't do this.
Yeah.
So the insurance company was out, and then we looked at 5 other potential business models at that intersection. I blogged my way through all of this, by the way. It's all in my Substack. Each one of these ideas has its own post.
Oh, cool.
So people can read that if they want. Your listeners, viewers can read that if they want. It's my last name, steinman.substack.com. Anyway, so blogged our way through each one of those ideas. Idea number 3, yeah, we like this, we don't like that, not going to do it. 4, like this, like that, not going to, but dislike that, not going to do it. Eventually, the idea that we settled on, that we did get to conviction around, was that, and what we're doing is there is no place that you can go today that will very simply pull together all of the data streams that exist on an industrial infrastructure and then correlate all that information together. So there are companies that you can go to that will tell you when like an IP address that was previously associated with like the Russian GRU like hit your firewall, and they'll send you a little ding, like notification, like, hey, check this out. But no one that's looking at that and that's looking at your change management system, like the work orders that get put in for your actual industrial infrastructure, and then looking at the actual endpoints themselves. Mm-hmm. Like, hey, something weird happened on the CNC machine, and drawing all that stuff together and saying, hey, actually, we've got a bunch of things here from a bunch of different systems, and you should really take a look at it. And so that's what we're building. A lot of people are like, that doesn't exist today. The answer is it doesn't. Mm-hmm. The state of industrial cybersecurity, it's early days. And most of the great companies that have already been built are single data streams coming off of, for example, like your networking, your like Ethernet.
Yeah.
And so the reason why we're building it is that this trend that I articulated in the NatCon speech that we talked about here, like we're digitizing our infrastructure, we're digitizing our industry, all of our industries. I personally think that's a terrible idea. I said this in the speech.
Yeah.
But it's happening, and there's literally nothing.
You have the line, everything from coffee cup to our fridges.
That's right. Yeah, everything.
What is the digital coffee cup?
They sold it at the Apple Store for a while.
Wow.
It was Bluetooth connected. It had a heating element.
So on your
it.
phone. So you would just, I guess.
Yeah, I'm drinking matcha. I'm drinking a matcha latte, and the app says that matcha lattes should be kept at whatever, 138 degrees or something. And so the heating element inside the coffee mug like keeps the matcha latte at the ideal temperature.
The essentials.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. First world technologies. And so, again, I don't think that it's wise. If I had some like wizard's wand, I would not have that be the case, but we're doing it.
Yeah.
So if we're going to do it, we need tools to be able to facilitate the defense of those things, of those massive infrastructures, because, and on Twitter I talk about this often. Cyber attacks have this amazing breadth of potential targets they can hit. Last year, cream cheese factories on the East Coast, meat processing plants, again, water, power, sewer, etc. So, we're building that sort of like blanket technology, umbrella technology that's going to be able to pull in all these disparate data streams and then very simply articulate and identify when suspicious stuff is happening across all of them. Doesn't exist today. People always ask like, well, why doesn't it exist today? There is only about 10,000 Americans that understand industrial control systems cybersecurity because the component skill sets required, the skill stack you need, people get paid very well for just having one of them never mind 3 of them. So it takes like a special type of person to go out and learn like all the mechanical engineering stuff that you need and the electrical engineering stuff that you need, and then the sort of computational stuff that you need. Like, someone that can go work at Schneider Electric, those jobs are incredibly well paid. Like, why are they ever going to learn JavaScript?
Yeah.
Like, why are they ever going to learn C++? Like, maybe they might learn
Probably
both those
not
things.
like an efficient allocation of time.
Exactly. Like, and then maybe they'll learn it to get like a little bit better at their job, but they're already incredibly well paid. They're at a great company, et cetera. And then for that person to then go out and be like, oh, and I want to go understand all like cybersecurity, it's just incredibly rare. And so part of the reason why we're building this technology is because I believe, my co-founders believe that there's going to be this massive human crunch where we're going to need, we already need like 3x the number of people that we've got. We're going to need like 10, 15x. And so we need to build solutions that can enable human beings that are not proficient in all those things, but conversant in them, right? Like, so the cybersecurity guy, the IT guy can actually take a look at the system and very clearly understand what's happening. It's explained in plain language. It's like, hey, these 3 things happen in quick succession. You should probably go check out X. So that's what we're building.
So for the last 2 questions, I think we've got a pretty good view of a couple of different iterations of you. So there's high school recreational analyst you, there's military officer you, there's NSC you, and now there's like startup founder you. Mm-hmm. What keeps this collective person up at night in these categories?
My memory is.
Triggering experience.
Yeah, what keeps... I sleep very well. I feel very proud of the things that I've done previously. I'm laser focused on building the company, on building Galvanick, because it's a thing that needs to exist now, and that need is compounding over time. And so, yeah, nothing really keeps me up at night. Like what hiring.
Yeah.
We are hiring right now. Go to my Twitter and I'll post all the jobs that we're looking for. Mostly engineers at this point. We've got a 5-person team with 3 part-time. We're going to grow to around 10, 12 people, hopefully in the next 6 months.
Are you guys venture backed?
Yeah. So we're backed by some great investors. I'll be making an announcement later about that, but many of the people that we both know.
Yep.
Yeah. So
then the last question, because seriously, I really mean this. I would love to go back in time and interview high school you.
Oh, jeez.
You'd probably be a terrible, because you're very eloquent, but eloquent in the way that you pick up like over time. So I doubt high school you actually would have been an incredible interview. But if you were to, place yourself back in high school now, can you at all imagine what topic within the broad frames of, I guess, what would you be interested in right now, do you think?
You mean if
you were a high schooler now?
Right now.
Yeah, like what would be, and maybe, you're, crushing TikTok with geolocation, but like, what do you think that would be?
God, I'm going to sound like, I'm going to sound really terrible. I really think that, God forgive me, Web3.
Oh.
No. Hear me out. So if you think of the digital world as a soft technology, a layer that exists across all of reality, right? Like there's a digital layer in this room right here. It's that camera. Mm-hmm. It's your phone, which is telling the tower, like physically where you are right now. It's the IP address that, is telling the website that's hanging on your browser that like you last did X, Y, or et cetera. Like there's a digital layer. It exists in reality. We know this is true. Right now, that architecture is built around these massive centers of gravity, massive server farms run by big companies like Amazon, right? AWS, which powers some numbered percentage of the web. Facebook, which which many people believe is the internet, if they're not that nuanced. Twitter, etc. That's what we call Web 2. All that stuff's going to get reorganized over the next 10 to 15 years, in my opinion, into much more decentralized type of architecture that hopefully, in my mind, is going to be much more focused on privacy and ownership of information by the individual. So I was a very early believer, and still am, in a technology called Urbit, which is early Web3 technology. Obviously, I was the coordinator of all crypto policy. Most proud achievement was that nothing really happened.
Yeah.
It took a lot of work to make sure that that was the case, though. There were a lot of people that wanted to do like KYC for every crypto transaction in the world, which would have literally destroyed the crypto industry. So did a lot of work to make sure that didn't happen. But yeah, I think that's like an interesting place to look right now. That would not have attracted high school me because I was very much focused on like cool guy things. You know, as an athlete, I went out, did a bunch of like backpacking in my spare time, mountaineering, etc. But for like broad technology stuff, yeah, I would look into that Web3 world. In the foreign policy space, I have done a lot of reading of the sort of pre and early, 20th century European revolutions. So books like, Mine Were of Trouble, like the fights around how Europe sort of evolved in that early 20th century. I think that understanding moments of transition between large centralized entities and more disparate entities, because those things run in cycles, like that's probably where I would be looking today.
Interesting.
And so that'd be my advice for that foreign policy stuff.
Well, with all that, Josh, this is actually honestly really been a blast. I'm glad that I'm back in person, and thanks for making the trek out here.
Thanks for having me, Marshall. It's great. Yeah. Joshua Steinman on Twitter.
There it is.
Yeah.